in here I'm going to create a new project file called PHP7. And within there we have an index.php file, and if I open up the browser we go to localhost.php7. Again, make sure your Apache server is running, and you should be able to see that that script is now in fact running. And if we take a look at this index.php file, you'll see there that all it's doing is it's just echoing out a string right here. So I'm going to delete the string, and now I want to create a function, and this function is going to receive X amount of parameters. It could be a random number amount of parameters, and then we're going to take a look at type coercion once I've done that. So I'm going to create a function, and then I'm going to give it the name of parse, and we're going to open and close the brackets and open and close the parentheses. So the parentheses define the execution context, which is just simply a list of instructions that you give to the compiler. Once it's finished executing, then what happens is it deletes the arguments that are stored in memory. Now, we need to define the argument, and this argument is going to be a special argument because it's going to take multiple parameters, multiple values. So I'm just going to put in the ... So what this symbolizes is you could have maybe 2 parameters, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 500 parameters. And what I want you to do is shove it inside of an array, and we need to go ahead and give that a name. So we're creating an argument which is just a temporary variable called int, and this array, because we put the ... right there, will receive all of the parameters, all of the values that are being passed in. Alright, so now what I want to do is I want to echo out the results, and what I'm going to do is pop this in the pre-element, and what I want to do is use the JSON encode function, and then we need to pass in the value, which is going to be the value that's stored in the int array. You could say ints, a little bit better. So we have an array that contains lots of ints, and I'm just going to say JSON pretty print, all caps. So this will just make this nicely formatted JSON text, and then when I stick it in the pre-tags, it will look right in the browser. Now at the moment, if I was to run the script, nothing would happen because we're just creating the function, we're not invoking the function. So I'm going to invoke the function, and I'm going to pass in parameters. So parameters are the values. So if you had, let's say, the value of 20, or a string of 200, or a floating point number, 22.22, or a Boolean value, such as true or false, these are all parameters. Each one of these is a parameter, and these parameters populate arguments, which is variables. And what will happen here is PHP will say, okay, we have 3 dots, and then we have this parameter right here called ints. And that is essentially telling PHP, create an array inside of this argument, and then shove all of these values into that array. So I could have 200 parameters here, or I could have maybe 2 parameters, or in my case, I'm going to have 4 parameters. And it's going to take those parameters and it's going to shove them into the array. And then all we're doing is we're saying, right, when you execute, all I want you to do is just print out the contents of what's stored inside of the ints argument. And I'm also going to end that with a semicolon right there, and let's go back and hit refresh. So what it did was it received all of those parameters, those values, and it chucked it into the ints array. So that's how an array is symbolized in JSON. It has the square brackets, and then we have a few different data types in this array. We have an integer, we have a string, we have a floating point data type, and also we have the Boolean data type as well. Now this may be a bit of an issue. Let's say I wanted to iterate through the elements of this array, so each one of these elements right here, and I wanted to add them together. Well, you can't add an integer with a string data type. And also, let's say I don't want any fractional numbers because they can cause problems when doing addition and so forth. So that's a little bit of an issue. And also, I certainly can't use a Boolean data type in a mathematical equation. So in lieu of that fact, what I need to do is I need to coerce them to be the same data type. And that is, I want them to be an integer. Now, before I continue, I want to explain two very important words in order for us to understand what we're doing in this lecture. The first one is polymorphism, and the second one is coercion. Now, polymorphism just means in many forms. Now, this might sound complicated, but it's not. In fact, it occurs daily, all the time around us. The environment, for example, polymorphs. It adapts, comes in many forms, in order to adapt to the situation. So whenever you think of polymorphism, just think of adaptation. And in programming, we also have this. For example, let's say that we have the plus operator. Now in JavaScript, not in PHP, but in JavaScript, the plus operator polymorphs. So it can add two numbers together, but it can also concatenate two strings together. And also it can take a string and a number, and it will then convert the number into a string and concatenate the two strings together. So you can see here that the plus operator adapts to the environment it's thrown into, whether it's given two numbers, or whether its environment consists of two strings, or a number and a string, and so forth. So the plus operator in JavaScript polymorphs. So that's all polymorphism means. It just means coming in many forms or adapting to the environment around it. Now, likewise, we have coercion, and this is where the two topics will come together. If I try to coerce you, it means I'm trying to get you to do something. Likewise, if we do type coercion in PHP, what we're actually doing is we're telling the PHP compiler to coerce the data to fit a certain data type. So in my case, I have an array of 4 elements. Now the issue is that the 4 elements can have different values. That's not a problem. The problem is the data types differ. So if I wanted to add all of the numbers together or all of the data together, then PHP will throw out an error and say, look, you're trying to add all these different data types. You have a number in here, which is an integer, and then you have a string, and you also have a float and a Boolean data type. So this will cause an error through the PHP compiler. So I need to coerce these data types so that they match, and then I know it's safe to do, let's say, a calculation of all of the elements in the array. So let's take my example. I have 4 elements in my array. Now, first of all, I need to decide what data type I want to coerce these elements into. So we're going to go with an integer data type. So the first element in the array is of the type integer. The number 20 is an integer, so it doesn't have to coerce it. Now, secondly, we have a string. Now, if the string resembles a formatted number, then PHP is very smart. It can look at that string and convert it into a number. If, however, it contains something like a sentence or a word, then the PHP compiler will not be able to coerce that data type, and you will get an error. And that's actually what you want. You want to get an error so that you know you're passing in a wrong parameter. So, in my case, this string of 200, yes, it is a string, but it's not a word, it's not any sort of legible English, it is in fact all numeric. So that can quite easily be coerced into an integer. Next up, we have a floating point. Now, a floating point isn't allowed in an integer data type. A floating point number simply is a fractional number. It has a decimal place. So all the PHP compiler has to do to turn that into an integer data type is strip away the decimal place and all of the fractional numbers after it. Once it gets rid of those fractional numbers, it's now an integer. You've only got the whole numbers left. Now also, you may be thinking, well, now we have a Boolean value, true or false. And many programming languages polymorph true and false into 0 and 1. 0 being false and 1 being true. So it's actually very easy to coerce the Boolean data type into an integer as well. So that process